Welcome to the Vision for Life podcast, an ongoing conversation between the pastors of Fellowship Denver and the church at large. Each week, we talk about life, faith, the Bible, and how to follow Jesus as we go about our daily lives. I'm Autumn, the host of the podcast, and Hunter is joining me on the podcast again today. Hunter, welcome.
Autumn, it's good to be here, although I can barely hear you because the rain is pounding on the roof underneath which we're sitting. There's probably a good 10 feet of distance between me and you, and so it sounds like you are off in a cave somewhere talking to me from afar.
Yeah, we're going to have some nice white noise in the background.
With varying intensity.
Throughout this episode because of the rain shower that's currently going on.
Those who know our church building know that we have this one big canopy roof. It's almost like a balloon. It just kind of expands and contracts, and occasionally holes get poked in it and water comes through. So we're in for an adventure today.
Yeah, we said we were ready for this podcast episode, but we'll see. We'll see if the rain distracts us or not. But we are going to jump into our conversation. You and I read an article together, Hunter, that we found really insightful. It's in the April 2023 edition of The Atlantic. It's written by George Packer, and it's called The Moral Case Against Equity Language. Before we begin talking about the content of the article itself and our thoughts about it, the points we derived from it, can you give us some information about the author and summarize the article for us?
George Packer is a novelist. He's also an essay writer. He's also written several nonfiction books. He is an observer of American life and American culture, particularly political culture in the broad sense of politics, not in the micro sense of electoral politics, Republican and Democrats, but in the broad sense of how do the institutions and the power structures of our society work together for better or for worse. George Packer is a very keen observer of that. He sits on probably the center left of the American cultural spectrum. And he, as you mentioned, is written for the New Yorker. He now writes in the Atlantic. And he also sits in this stream of writers on the center left who are becoming more and more disenchanted with some of the trends from the left. And those are often some of the most interesting critiques to read because they don't come from the polar opposite end of our political spectrum, but they come from inside. And so George Packer here is critiquing a trend that exists on the cultural left, but which is being felt by people all across our culture.
The title itself, The Moral Case Against Equity Language, can be a bit muddled. So let's talk about that first. What does George Packer mean by equity language, and why is he constructing a case in this article against equity language?
Listen to how the article begins. The Sierra Club's Equity Language Guide discourages using the word stand, American, blind, and crazy. The first two fail at inclusion because not everyone can stand and not everyone living in this country is a citizen. The third and fourth, even as figures of speech, legislators are blind to climate change, are insulting to the disabled. The guide also rejects the disabled in favor of people living with disabilities for the same reason that enslaved person has generally replaced slave, to affirm by the tenet of what's called people first language that everyone is first and foremost a person, not their disability or other identity. The guide's purpose is not just to make sure that Sierra Club avoids obviously derogatory terms such as welfare queen. It seems to cleanse language of any trace of privilege, hierarchy, bias, or exclusion. In its zeal, the Sierra Club has clear-cut a whole national park of words, urban, vibrant, hardworking, and brown bag, all crashed to earth for subtle racism. Y'all supplants the patriarchal you guys, I'm actually in favor of that one, and elevate voices replaces empower, which used to be uplifting but is now condescending. The poor is classist, battle and minefield, disrespect veterans, depressing, appropriates a disability, migrant, no explanation, it just has to go.
In that introductory section of the article that you read, Hunter, Packer is showing via these examples from the Sierra Club's guide what equity language is. And so it's a sort of monitoring and reassigning use of language in an attempt to, as he then says, eliminate hierarchy, bias. There are a couple of other words that you read there that he uses to explain sort of the attempted effect of that language.
To cleanse language of any trace of privilege, hierarchy, bias, or exclusion.
There it is, yes.
One of the things I love about Packer's writing, this is true of good writing in general, is it describes and shows before it explains. And so he opens the article by just showing you some of this equity language. And he mentions equity language guides. He goes on to say equity language guides, which are style guides. Some of our listeners might be familiar with Strunk and White, which was is a style guide, like a writing style guide that's been used in high schools and university settings for generations. And there are now style guides being given and used in different settings. He mentions nonprofits like the Sierra Club. He mentions university settings. Sometimes they're being used in corporate settings, which are really trying to coach the people working in those settings to use language in a different way than maybe they would intuitively do. So he says equity language guides are proliferating among some of the country's leading institutions, particularly nonprofits. And he goes on to list a bunch of these different equity language guides. And he actually traces them to a couple of sources that seem to be writing and producing these guides. And so he's observing not just that these guides are being used, but that this phenomenon of trying to eliminate the usage of a lot of words that are part of our kind of common vernacular and replace them with other words that seem to have less bias or hierarchy or hints of privilege in them. This is a problem, or this is a trend, and he's saying it's a problem. He's making a moral case against it. That's his title, Moral Case Against It. And he's essentially going to argue that these things don't achieve the moral aims that they claim to achieve and actually have moral consequences that are not good.
Mm-hmm. One of the moral claims that they purportedly achieve is included in that section, that introductory section of the article that you read, that is, quote, everyone is first and foremost a person, not their disability or other identity. That seems, as contained in that quote, to be a good goal. What about it is failing then morally to achieve what it sets out to do?
Well, before we go there, maybe it's good just to stop and go, why do we think this is important to even talk about? Like, we want to be helpful to our listeners in living out a biblical vision for their life. Why do we choose to jump onto this?
We chose to discuss it because we found this article particularly insightful. We are feeling cultural pressure to adapt to this sort of language and use this sort of language. Perhaps this is in your workplace. Perhaps you have to go through specific training even in your workplace. Many people mention this is the way they experience this. And then we see it pop up in media, in ads, in school. I've seen this in the realm of education through the lens of my kids being in school. And so as we feel this cultural pressure, sometimes I think we feel a dissonance with it as well, but don't quite know why. And so we found this article particularly helpful to that end. And then, as always, what we do on the podcast, as you just mentioned, Hunter, is that we seek to understand things from a biblical framework and to root our existence in lived reality as followers of Jesus back into that biblical foundation. And this article helps us to that end.
And I thought, as I read this article, when I talk to normal people who don't live and work their whole lives inside the church, like I do a lot, they describe this dynamic happening in their workplaces. And some of them in corporate settings, some of them in academic settings, some of them in nonprofit settings, which he alludes to. But they see this happening in their workplace where it does seem that language is being used in a different way and they're being coached to use language in a different way. And sometimes they're just kind of feel some sense of I don't quite know how to navigate this and to think about all this. Packer actually brings that out in the article, that it tends to create a little bit of anxiety, like, am I doing this right? Am I not doing this right? And then they want to think about it as Christians and how their faith informs their use of words and language. And so I think this hits a lot of people where they work and within the institutions in our culture where they live, maybe where their kids go to school, or perhaps where they volunteer.
And Packer's observing that this emphasis on equity language has a specific impact, as you're describing, in corporate America particularly, and then in nonprofit sectors. And so we're going to examine what that specific impact is and how this is taking shape, and then why then we feel that effect, that cultural sort of pressure, whether, when I say cultural pressure, that could exist within a specific organization, or you could pick this up just from culture at large. Let's summarize a couple of Packer's main critiques. So the first of this, as you identified for us, Hunter, is that there are these two trends, or even we could call them two cultures, present in America that reinforce this polarization that we feel. What are those two cultures? What do you mean by this polarizing kind of trend?
He is highlighting the fact that this language is being dictated. It's not evolving from the general use of language among people, but rather it's being dictated by authorities who are kind of casting it down from on high. And I think this is actually part of a broader trend in American life where there is sometimes called elites, and that term I think is fairly useful. It is people who have quite a bit of cultural capital and power and work within culturally influential institutions and organizations. And often the leadership of these organizations is dictating the use of this language to the people who work below them, and then that tends to flow out into the rest of the culture. And what it creates in American life is there's a real sense of ordinary people and elite people, and there's these two kind of groups, and there's a lot of resentment starting to build between these two groups of people. He observes that these guides refer to language evolving, and he says, but that's really not the case. These changes are revolutions from above. They haven't emerged organically from the shifting linguistic habits of large numbers of people. They are handed down in communiques written by obscure experts who purport to speak for vaguely defined communities, remaining unanswerable to a public that's being morally coerced. And so there's just this moral coercion from on high. He later in the article observes it kind of operates like religion used to operate in American life, where religious authorities would kind of speak from exalted positions to the populace, and he's just observing that it reinforces this polarization and this hierarchy that is really dividing American life and making it hard for us to work together.
Mm-hmm. You used the term elite because that is commonly the term employed to identify this kind of group or class of people. Much of the sourcing of this kind of language is coming out of that class. In the religious comparison, are you saying, Hunter, then that in a way they're making themselves the arbiters of a kind of righteousness or justice? I think that accounts for why we feel uncomfortable at times in the shifting use of language and in our own use of language, because we actually don't want to be on the wrong side of these issues, and we don't want to intentionally or unintentionally offend people. But in this rapidly shifting kind of use of language, you can often find yourself on the wrong side of it. But the standard itself is arbitrary. You don't always know if you are using or employing the terminology correctly. So you have a sense then of this kind of paralysis in it.
Yes, he later says the instructions seem designed to make users so anxious they can barely speak. meaning, in fact, he points out to examples in the language guides where they have to acknowledge, like, you're going to get it wrong sometimes, and you have to just own that and try to commit to doing better next time.
Commit to doing better.
Commit to doing better. but they come laden with moral claims and moral coercion. And you are right if you learn to use this language correctly, and you're not in the right if you don't learn to use this language correctly. He later says this is the same spirit as the Puritans of early America, and I don't know how well George Packer understands the Puritans, but I think it's interesting that he reaches for an analogy to conservative religion in order to describe the effect that he thinks these are having.
Mm. This use of language fits into the postmodern construct or postmodern use of language that we've observed before in different ways. And this pops up in current activist spaces often as well. A postmodern use of language rejects the historical typical use of language in that it reflected reality. This use of language is an attempt to construct a type of reality or to impose a sort of construct upon reality.
And in particular, it's an attempt to make the world a more just place. So it is an attempt through the use of language to construct justice and equity. Now, he's going to argue, and this is maybe gets into our second critique, he's going to argue it does not do that, and that it in fact reinforces structural injustice. So this is his moral case against it. Not only does it not achieve the moral aim that it claims to create a more just society, but it actually desensitizes us to real hard realities and real injustices, and probably keeps them more stuck.
So if our first insight of this article that we want to emphasize is that there are these two cultures present in America, and the use of equity language and the way in which it's enforced upon people actually creates a kind of polarization. And then the second, as you just mentioned, Hunter, is that it has this effect of blunting hard realities. And maybe that is in a good attempt, actually, to see people who experience a particular hardship. Why is it that it falls short, though, in its attempt to actually help people?
Let me read you his critique in his own words. The whole tendency of equity language is to blur the contours of hard, often unpleasant facts. This aversion to reality is its main appeal. Once you acquire the vocabulary, it's actually easier to say people with limited financial resources than the poor. The first rolls off your tongue without interruption, leaves no aftertaste, arouses no emotion. The second is rudely blunt and bitter, and it might make someone angry or sad. Imprecise language is less likely to offend. Good writing, vivid imagery, strong statements will hurt because it's bound to convey painful truths. So here's what he's going to say. This language actually helps us not feel and sense the full effects of injustice and hard realities, and by smoothing those over and making them more palatable, easier to say, slightly less offensive, it actually increases the likelihood that nothing will be done about them. Nothing concrete will actually ever be done about them. So I'm thinking here of someone who actually really cares about justice and really cares about injustice. And George Packer is making this point. Adopting this language can make you feel like you're doing something about injustice. But what it's actually doing is making you feel better about that injustice without actually having done a concrete thing about it. Like, for example, the poor, like by getting involved in their lives.
There's one facet of this conversation that I find curious within this. I see what Packer is pointing out about this effect, that smoothing over these hard realities actually make them more palatable for the person employing the language. So saying someone affected by the criminal justice system might make me feel better. When I think about someone who is in prison, who has gone through the criminal justice system, received a sentence, and is experiencing life in prison, which might be very hard, it does nothing. My use of that language does nothing to actually help that person's reality. And if I am concerned about criminal justice system reform for instance, or prison reform, then using that language isn't impacting anyone who is already caught in that system. But I have a question about that. I do think that one of the attempts, although I see clearly how it falls short, is to remove a sort of stigma from some of these categories. For instance, using the term the poor, I don't find that particularly stigmatizing. However, often people who have very limited financial resources find themselves just sort of caught at the behest of whether the governmental system that they're trying to navigate or the people around them who don't know how to help or overlook their condition. And so in that, the attempt to say, well, people might hold a certain perspective through this new use of language, we want to help them have a different perspective about the actual person. So about this person, a poor person, a person who is in prison. So why is that attempt still, why does it end up becoming so convoluted in this process?
I love that you're asking this question, and I think you're actually going beyond what he's addressing in the article. You're perhaps thinking about some of the unintended consequences of his critique, and what if we don't use this language that he's critiquing. And as I just kind of think of that off the cuff, my response would be, what dignifies people is our presence and treating them as full human beings, not just talking about them in a different kind of way. And so real relationship and assuming that this person brings the capacities of humanity with them. One of the central insights from like Christian community development is what people who are in poverty need is not just for people who are wealthy to give them things, but rather they need to cultivate the talents and the abilities they have. So, for example, what our friends at Cross Purpose do to give job and career skills, both hard and soft skills, to people who are unemployed or who are living on government support, so they can become self-sustaining, is developing them as people, and it relates to them assuming like you're not impaired as a person just because you're in poverty. So I think interacting with people like that in that manner is the way we dignify them, not just using different kinds of language. And if I'm like running a nonprofit that does that, I actually want to limit my use of this kind of language because I don't want the people who are trying to help for themselves to be desensitized to the hard realities that people actually live in.
Mm-hmm. Attempting to smooth over or soften that hard reality has unintended consequences, and that is what Packer's observing. And we see this displayed in many different dimensions. You're giving a real life example of how using softened language might impact someone in the sense of their work. They need to be met with the hard reality. Someone working in a nonprofit addressing a specific issue in society actually needs to see the hard reality of the people who they're attempting to help or attempting to serve, attempting to lift up. It has this effect in the dimension of the softened language, also has an effect in the dimension of writing. And Packer gives us a really clear example of that.
He talks about a book by Catherine Boo called Behind the Beautiful Forevers, which is a nonfiction book published in 2012 where the author had gone and embedded herself in a Mumbai slum, and she's describing the conditions there and the life of people there. And he quotes one paragraph that she wrote that he thinks is particularly descriptive. It goes like this: "The one leg's given name was Sita. She had fair skin, usually an asset, but the runt leg had smacked down her bride price. Her Hindu parents had taken the single offer they got. Poor, unattractive, hardworking, Muslim, old. Half dead, but who else wants her, as her mother had once said with a frown." Now, he then goes on and says, I don't know if we translate that into this updated language. It might read like this. Sita was a person living with a disability. Because she lived in a system that centered whiteness while producing inequities among racial and ethnic groups, her physical appearance conferred an unearned set of privileges and benefits, but her disability lowered her status to potential partners. Her parents, who were Hindu persons, accepted a marriage proposal from a member of a community with limited financial resources, a person whose physical appearance was defined as being different from the traits of the dominant group and resulted in his being set apart for unequal treatment, a person who was considered in the dominant discourse to be, quote, hardworking, a Muslim person, an older person. In referring to him, Sita's mother used language that is considered harmful by representatives of historically marginalized communities. He goes on and says this translation doesn't create more empathy for Sita and her struggles. Just the opposite. It alienates Sita from the reader, placing her at greater distance. A heavy fog of jargon rolls in and hides all that Boo's short burst of prose make clear with true understanding and true empathy. So he's saying we're going to tend to empathize less with people when the hard realities of their life is blunted by the language we're using.
Packer points out the necessity of using specific language and the effect when we don't use specific language. Even in your example a moment ago, Hunter, of someone who might work in a nonprofit setting and feel or sense this pressure, especially as we see just sort of at large the way in which this is moving into nonprofit spaces quite effectively, how using specific language actually clarifies one's mission and understanding, not only of the reality of the people who the nonprofit is constructed to help, to serve, to lift up, but also then in understanding their own place within it. Packer is pointing out a sort of cynicism that exists through the use of equity language. He's saying that you can represent a form of progress through language if you adhere to this morally constructed standard that isn't actually aligned with a sort of material progress. And he's saying that material progress actually addressing a certain sort of injustice, actually being able to help someone who is financially impoverished, are more important and necessary for the whole of society than simply using language that makes the user feel better about that situation.
I think this is one of his central insights, that the end result of this equity language, and maybe the unconscious reason why people like it, is it makes people who aren't suffering feel better without actually doing something. He says these equity guides want to make the ugliness of our society disappear by linguistic fiat. Even by their own lights, they do more ill than good, not because of their absurd bans on ordinary words like congresswoman and expat or the self-torture they require of conscientious users, but because they make it impossible to face squarely the wrongs they want to right, which is the starting point for any change. The starting point for any change is to simply face reality. And he's saying this causes us to not fully face reality.
And this stands in stark contrast to a biblical idea of justice, which is, as Packer, in the way Packer describes it, a material form of progress. It is actually moving towards the vulnerable and the marginalized and offering presence, personal presence, which you mentioned just a moment ago.
Yeah, biblical justice is to move into the places where the fabric of our society is broken and where people are falling through the cracks, to move into it, and to move into it with your own self and with your own financial resources, and to get involved. That is what biblical justice requires of us. So when Scripture, and you see this especially in the Old Testament, when it describes the righteous person is typically someone who, through hard work and discipline and through following God's law and through following the principles of biblical wisdom has built a stable, secure, sometimes even prosperous life. And they're now going to take that and use their life to build up others, especially those who are falling through the cracks. And the point is, like, they do it in a material way, to use your description. They use their actual money and they use their actual lives. And so they don't just live for themselves, but they do that in a material way. And it is fascinating to think the Bible does not use this sanitized language. The Bible uses very blunt terms: sin, evil, unrighteousness. It uses terms like this: idolatry. It calls things what they are with simple, blunt terms in ordinary vernacular. Even the biblical languages, the Hebrew of the Old Testament, the Koine Greek of the New Testament, were simple, ordinary languages that most people spoke, and the vocabulary is ordinary, most people vocabulary. And there's really no attempt to dignify people by somehow smoothing over the hard realities they live in. The Bible dignifies people by saying everyone is created in God's image and everyone is sinful. And so it puts us all on a level playing field. We are all created by God and we are all sinful. And so we all need salvation in Christ. And we also all need people to move into our lives and to help us overcome the effects of sin and the fall in our lives.
Mm. One of the quotes from the article that we mentioned is that the attempt of equity language that it falls short of is to say that everyone is first and foremost a person, not their disability or other identity. Interestingly, the clear, simple, accessible to everyone use of language that is evidenced for us in Scripture does that. It says clearly, everyone is on this level playing field. Everyone has inherent dignity and value vis-a-vis being created in the image of God. And everyone experiences the effect of sin in their life, and that should generate in us a distinct compassion for each other. But it's through the use of clear, accessible language that we come to that understanding.
And Jesus says things like, I came not to call the righteous, but sinners. And he doesn't say, I came to call people experiencing sin or people experiencing the impacts of sin or people who are created in God's image but are sinning. He just says sinners. And it's an honest anthropology that says as we sin, we become so enmeshed with our sin. And because we are born with a sinful nature, sin becomes such part of our nature that it's actually, to fully capture the reality of this, you have to say sinners. Mm. And then where Jesus dignifies sinners is he said, I came for them. Mm. I came to call them. I came to be with them. I came to give myself for them. I came to save them. And that kind of directness has a way of breaking through the defense mechanisms we have in a way that I think the language Packer is describing only reinforces some of these defense mechanisms.
The clear use of biblical language not only gives us clarity about our spiritual condition and our need, but also about the beauty of redemption. So I think of this passage in Luke 4 at the beginning of Jesus' ministry when he goes to Nazareth into the synagogue and reads from the scroll of Isaiah. And Jesus says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, as he's quoting from the scroll. He says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. And he uses specific language because someone who is blind cannot see and needs to know he cannot see in order to be offered the sight that is offered through the redemption that Jesus embodied and effected on our behalf. He proclaims good news to the poor because someone who is poor knows that they are needy, that they need certain help that they might not be able to generate on their own behalf. And Jesus says he's coming to do that. to the captives, the blind, the oppressed. Someone who's oppressed knows that he needs a savior to release him from this oppression. So the clear language not only helps us understand our spiritual condition and our need, but also helps us understand the beauty of the gospel and what Jesus offers.
And I think it's good here just to end with Packer's conclusion. He says, the project of the guides is utopian, but they are a symptom of deep pessimism. They belong to a fractured culture in which symbolic gestures are preferable to concrete actions. Argument is no longer desirable. Each viewpoint has its own impenetrable dialect, and only the most fluent insiders possess the power to say what is real. And our exhortation for our listeners, and it was for us as well, was as people of the Word of God and as followers of Jesus, let's use real language, descriptive language, and biblical language, and let's do real justice that really gets involved in people's lives, and let's do real evangelism that really gets involved in people's lives. And we need the full descriptive power of God's Word, which is blunt and realistic, and sometimes calls bad things bad things. We need that kind of language and those categories of thinking in order to be the people God's called us to be in the world.
Hunter, thanks for discussing this with me today. If you have questions about today's episode or suggestions about what you'd like to hear us discuss on the podcast in the future, we love hearing from you. So send all of that anytime to podcast@fellowshipdenver.org. Thanks for joining us on the Vision for Life podcast. Special thanks to Adam Englund for our theme music, to Jesse Cowan, our producer, and to Judd Connell, who provides transcription for these episodes.